Okay, everyone. Welcome back to Freud. We're gonna just sort of walk through the final chapters of Civilization's Discontents, chapters 6 through 8. I don't really know what to say to sum up the Freud that we've read here. I think it's interesting that toward the end in chapter 8, he himself sort of says, I don't really know what we've learned here. I think that in connection to the other things that we've read for this semester, the Arendt, the Descartes, the Sartre, what Freud gives us is a kind of systematic analysis of civilization. And that really what the value of this text is, I think, is to sort of illustrate a sociological, essentially, viewpoint on civilization. What Freud is really doing here is not so much psychology as sociology. I think it's interesting. I think what is most valuable about this book is, one of the central points of it. So, in that sense, it's successful, which is an analysis of the aggression toward civilization. And why do we hate civilization? I think that is sort of the most important point. He's sort of purportedly thinking about a number of things, right? Why are we unhappy in civilization? Where does our conscience come from? Where does our sense of guilt come from, which is connected to our misery in society, in civilization? But all of that, I think, is really in service of this bigger question of where does our essentially resentment of civilization come from? Why do we resent culture? Culture's theoretically, Freud thinks the sort of thesis position on civilization is it makes life easier, right? It's a luxury. It is efficient and convenient and provides us with all these comforts. So why should we be resentful of it and have this aggression toward it, right? Why do we resent having to do all the things that we have to do to be part of civilization? And that's really his major idea here, his major question. And so we've seen part of the answer to that, right? In the last couple of chapters, we see this sort of lashing out at an overly strict concept of justice that is imposed by civilization, which can, on the one hand, be a valid sort of rebellion against an overly censorious and overly strict society. And then on the other hand, we have kind of rebellion against civilization, which is not justified, which is the rejection of any of civilization's imperatives or demands, but not because of a kind of intellectual disagreement about the limits of justice or what it's reasonable for a civilization to ask, right? Not a kind of rational dispute about what sorts of things civilization can demand, right? So, from a Freudian perspective here, perhaps it would be legitimate to rebel against certain, forms of, like liberal language policing or something like that, right? That uh, it is too strict a demand to require everyone to be, using the most sensitive and most, newest politically correct language, right? So we can see Freud sort of being on the, you know, aligned with the sort of intellectual dark web characters out there in today's America, who argue essentially, right, that society has become too strict, that we have too harsh a concept of social justice. Um, Whatever you make of that, right? Freud, I think, is right in arguing, that there is this one form of rejection of sort of the demands of civilization that is about a rational negotiation of what society is should be allowed to ask of us. However, on the other hand, he thinks, right, there's this other kind of rejection of civilization, which is a a sort of more straightforward resentment of civilization, which is the desire to return to a kind of pre-civilized brute state, right? I don't want to be, yoked by any kind of demand from civilization, right? Even the demand to, uh, not kill, right, or not steal, sort of basic demands of living in society, the building blocks of civilization, right? That there would be a resentment toward those, right? I want to be completely free. I want to be as free as the animals. And that is, Freud thinks, an unhealthy kind of rejection of society. And I think, we can see that in a number of ways in today's America. Uh, right? We can think of Trump believing that it's good to have gotten away with not paying any taxes, right? That is just sort of a basic aggression toward the rules of civilization, right? We all pay taxes. There are only two certain things in life: death and taxes. And so that's a kind of, I refuse, even to go along with sort of the most basic demands of civilization. And my goal is, where you really see it in America today is in, the sort of celebration um, of kind of bullying or brute force, right, brutishness, that to my mind is a kind of staple of MAGA and Trump culture in general, right? That we want to, we celebrate the crudeness, the irreverent, sort of insulting, and just generally brutish character. So that, I think, it would tie into this Freudian idea of a kind of, base, animalistic, almost kind of rejection of anything having to do with civilization, right? The measure of a person is how much they can get away with, right? How much can you steal without being caught? How much can you get away with? And the more you're able to sort of dupe society and exploit people, the better. And Freud is very, he's specific about that. He says, one of the primary ways that this kind of brutishness is still possible in societies through, economic exploitation, through wealth inequality. And so there's something sort of, that is basically uncivilized about wanting to exploit people, wanting to, in every case, get your own self-satisfaction regardless of the cost to other people. Now, so the answers that we've seen so far as to the larger sort of dynamics that lead to this, on the one hand, that lead to civilization, and on the other hand, that lead to the resentment and rejection of civilization. That whole dynamic between development of civilization and then aggression toward civilization has so far, up until chapter 6, been explained through essentially definition of what civilization does, right? The basic function of civilization. And the basic function of civilization is to impose a libidinal economy, right? This phrase that Freud uses throughout, but especially in the first half of the book, I think is a very important and useful phrase. Civilization aims to maintain a libidinal economy that works for it, right? That works for civilization. Now, a libidinal economy, and I mentioned this in one of the previous videos, but maybe we'll go a little deeper into it, although probably not much, right? Libidinal economy is the way that you sort of channel and regulate the erotic drive, the drive of eros, the pleasure principle, the drive for sexual satisfaction. So we have this sort of fundamental, right, drive for sexual satisfaction. However, right, we learn as we grow older that this drive is dangerous, and it's dangerous because when we desire something, there's always the chance that we will not get it. This is the basic danger of the erotic drive, as Freud describes it here. The danger is that we won't get what we desire. And when we don't get what we desire, we are liable to ourselves become dangerous, right? To either fall into depression and endanger ourselves, or to become a danger to others, right? To lash out in some way. And so this sort of danger at an individual level then it's also in the interest of civilization to regulate everyone within civilization, to make sure that they don't become dangerous to themselves or to others. And the way that this is achieved is to provide ways of channeling that sexual energy into other outlets. And so we've seen this before. And this takes us back to that original point in chapter 1, right, about religion, art, and science. Religion, art, and science are the three main ways that we're able to channel this libidinal energy, right? So it's in the interest of civilization to persuade people or coerce people into indeed channeling their sexual energy into some of these disciplines, science or art or religion. Right? So civilization is found in religion, but also in the arts and in sciences. It's interesting, right? The things that we call civilization, I think Freud is basically right here in identifying those three things as sort of calling cards of civilization. And if we buy this psychoanalytic story, I think it's fairly persuasive, right? That there is this, sort of imperative that as a group, we all help each other find ways of releasing this energy. Because if that energy gets bottled up, it becomes a danger to the group. Okay? Um, and so, we can, the main ways that this happens, or the main way this happens, is through education, right? Education and sort of child rearing at an earlier stage are the ways that people learn to put their energy into other things, right? Where they discover objects that they desire that are substitutes for the object of their sexual desire. Um, so, I think that whole story is fairly believable, at least at a surface level. Now, I think it also is interesting in that, um, we could think about what are the causes for social breakdown, what are the factors that go into a civilization that is in the kind of chaos that our civilization is in. And Freud doesn't really say this explicitly here, but I think we can extrapolate from this book and say, well, what leads to resentment and aggression toward civilization and toward the civilized is the failure to actually, latch on to any of those main outlets of civilization: religion, science, or art. And just sort of thinking about the history of the 20th century, where all of those things are more than ever sort of beyond the reach of your average person, right? That science is so far advanced that your average layperson, that is non-professional scientist, isn't really able to pursue science. You can read pop science, you can watch Neil deGrasse Tyson, you can follow NASA on Instagram, but I think what Freud is thinking about is in doing scientific research, right? Being engaged in scientific thinking and pursuing something in the sciences. So reading pop science, watching Neil deGrasse Tyson, fascinating stuff, but it's not a satisfaction. It's more of an entertainment. And so the fact that, it's essentially requires a PhD to really pursue the sciences in maybe the way Freud means, what that means is that, your average person is not going to be able to sort of take up the sciences. There are plenty of examples that say otherwise, but I think that the rarefication of scientific research is perhaps a sort of cause of alienation within society, right? And the same would be true, I think, of art. That art has become, or in I think especially the mid 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, art becomes incredibly abstract and sort of inaccessible to, again, just sort of average civilian. And this, I think, also has a similar effect. It's the idea is it becomes then much more difficult for the average person to feel like they get what the point of art is, or could participate in serious art, in art that is truly satisfying and sort of civilizationally important. And then at the same time, right, we have in the end of the 19th and then through the 20th century, a emptying of the churches, right? The churches in Europe are empty, and religion in the United States becomes a really very different thing. There's not the same sort of civilization does not approve of religion in the way that it did in earlier centuries. So all of this is all of these factors are causes of alienation and reasons to become resentful and aggressive toward civilization. So I think it's interesting in that sense, right? I think in those sorts of broad strokes, Freud's theory makes some sense. So in chapter 6, then, let's get into it. In chapter 6, he wants to really, the point of chapter 6 is to go into a little bit more detail about this primordial drive toward aggression, right? And he is talking about this on 105 and 106. For Freud, and I mentioned this in the first Freud video, for Freud, there are two fundamental drives, right? And the first drive he discovers early in his career, right? And it's this drive that sort of makes his name, which is the pleasure principle, right? The drive to sexual satisfaction, the erotic drive. But later in his career, he discovers or begins to describe a second sort of basic drive in humanity. And this he calls the death drive, right? And the death drive is just as foundational as the pleasure principle, meaning that human beings constitutionally, not as a result of their upbringing, right? But because of their hardwiring, the human being has a drive to destruction, a drive to destroy. And so we might say equiprimordial, right? Equally primordial, equally primary is this death drive. And when Freud discovers this, when Freud describes this, when Freud begins to sort of observe tendencies in his clinical patients, right? Because remember, Freud thinks of himself as a scientist and is, sees psychoanalytic theory as kind of empirical science describing what he sees in his sessions with his patients. So when he begins to sort of, encounter these instincts, these psychological tendencies that can't be explained through the pleasure principle, he begins to posit this secondary drive, or the second drive, this death drive. And this really presents, well, rather than saying this presents problems for him, we'd say that this drive clears up a lot of problems for him. Because what leads Freud to posit the death drive is the observation of tendencies within his patients to pursue things that are destructive to them, right? A self-destructive drive, which he thinks cannot be reduced to the desire for pleasure, or in any case, is not about any kind of satisfaction, or rather, that satisfaction. And the way that pleasure is connected is that one gets pleasure from destruction. There's a kind of satisfaction, not just in attaining an object of desire, but also in destroying an object. Right? So that that satisfaction that we get, right, the completion of an urge that we get through, attaining the object of our sexual desire, we also get through the completion of destruction. And so this basic capacity for satisfaction is found not just in sexual pleasure, but also in destruction. And it's that destruction. So, what would examples of this be? I think it's, important that Freud introduces this idea in the context of narcissism. And so it could be observed that someone who is very narcissistic, that is to say, someone who does not hate themselves, and therefore wouldn't be destructive on account of an overly active superego or anything like that. Someone who's narcissistic still has this drive to destruction and aggression. So generally, Freud begins by saying, where does the desire to self-destruct come from? Why do we harm ourselves? Why do we do things that are unpleasurable? Why do we cut ourselves? Why do we drink ourselves to death? Why do we, pick your poison, right? And the original sort of hypothesis is this is a kind of punishment that we impose on ourselves. This is the consequence of an overactive superego, right? That the superego, that which is our conscience, that which sort of tells us what the right thing to do is, can make our egos miserable, right? We can be oppressed by our own superego. And when we are oppressed by our own superego, our own sense of what we should be or what we should do, right? When our expectations for ourselves are sort of crushingly high, then the ego resorts to self-destruction, right? And we want to, we become depressed, we become, melancholic. Anyway, Freud has a very specific definition of melancholia, but we become depressed and we can become self-destructive, right? If I can't, this pressure from my superego, I have to escape it. Right? So I'm going to drink myself into a stupor in order to no longer hear my superego. Right? This is what Freud actually begins with in Civilization and its Discontents, all these ways we have of sort of avoiding or dulling our conscience, that voice that tells us that we need to be better. So when we have that overly active conscience, we can become self-destructive. Right? We would do things that are unpleasurable or bad for us as an attempt to destroy our ego, destroy the relationship between ego and superego, to erase our psyche entirely. But what Freud observes is that this self-destruction and this urge to this aggressiveness is not just found among those who are, have self-hatred or an overactive superego, but it's also found in those who are narcissistic, right? Those who think, they're the greatest and adore themselves and have none of that self-hate. So where does that aggressiveness come from in otherwise well-adjusted or even maladjusted, but going the other direction toward narcissism? Where does this aggressiveness come from? And Freud is thinking about this also explicitly. He'll talk about this in the context of World War One, right? Why would a society start a world war for essentially no good reason, right? That's World War One, because of a network of alliances, because of this duke in Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, sorry, being assassinated. Where does all this aggression come from, right? How can even the sort of best among us, the noblest, the politicians, what have you, right? The theoretically the most well-adjusted people, certainly not neurotics, certainly not suffering from mental illness. Why are they so aggressive, right? Why aren't they just looking for pleasure? What is this drive to violence, to destruction? So Freud thinks there must be a fundamental drive to destruction and aggressiveness. So he says on 106, that is to say, as well as Eros, there was an instinct of death. The phenomena of life could be explained from the concurrent or mutually opposing action of these two instincts. It is not easy, however, to demonstrate the activities of the supposed death instinct. The manifestations of Eros were conspicuous and noisy enough. A more fruitful idea was that a portion of the instinct is diverted toward the external world, comes to light as an instinct of aggressiveness and destructiveness. Right, the death drive, the instinct of death is basic, right? And it is the dynamic between what Freud will call eros and thanatos. Thanatos being the Greek word for death, the dynamic between love and death, essentially, that makes life what it is. And these competing drives, on the one hand, to seek pleasure, to reproduce, and on the other hand, to inflict pain and destroy. And these are constantly sort of fighting each other, right? And essentially, this is going to be Freud's diagnosis of civilization. We can understand that resentment and hatred of civilization, perhaps simply as an expression of the death drive, of aggressiveness, this basic aggressiveness. So maybe I'll mention now, right at the very conclusion, this is one of Freud's main conclusions, and he'll say, remember he, in chapter, I believe it was 5, sort of marvels at that basic commandment of civilization, right? To love your neighbor as you love yourself. Freud is saying, right, this is so irrational. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, in particular, in the context of the pleasure principle. Right? Why would I love my neighbor in the same way that I love my wife or husband or family? Right? Just love some random person just because they're next to me. What's that about? Right now, love is specific. It's about loving the thing that you actually love, that you desire and want, right? The thing that satisfies you, that satisfies your pleasure principle. So this idea of love your neighbor makes no sense in the context of the pleasure principle. But he thinks perhaps it makes sense in the context of the death drive. Right? We have to love our neighbor not in the way that we love the object of our desire, but rather we have to love our neighbor instead of wanting to kill our neighbor. Right? That love your neighbor as you love yourself isn't about directing your love universally. Right? That whole discussion of universal love and the sort of problems with that. Instead, it is better interpreted, Freud seems to think, as don't do harm to your neighbor. Don't be aggressive toward your neighbor. And so it's a kind of not exhortation to love, right? It's not inspiring the impulse to desire or love. Instead, it is inhibiting the impulse to destruction. And so Freud thinks that this, and so I want to mention this because I think it's interesting, and we'll tie it in just a moment. Freud thinks that this death drive, this urge to destruction, is analogous to and is the cause of the idea of the devil. Right? So he's continuing to sort of try and psychoanalyze religion and religious ideas. And if God is a kind of externalization of my own superego, the devil is an externalization of my own death drive. Right? The devil is that which is pure negativity. Right? Evil, in its traditional interpretation, is pure negativity. That which takes away from things, that which destroys things, but which can produce nothing in itself. And so Freud thinks the concept of the devil is sort of religion's explanation for this fundamental death drive. And so here Freud is getting into what is really a very complicated philosophical problem, which is the existence of evil, right, which he talks about on page 108. Now, I don't think we need to get into why the existence of evil is such a problem metaphysically. But let's just say, in the simplest terms, if God is entirely good, how can there be evil in the world? If God is entirely good and God made all things, then where does evil come from? Either God creates evil and therefore is not entirely good, or God does not create all things and therefore is not all powerful, not really God. So that's the problem of evil in a nutshell. And Freud is, I think, kind of grappling with this same problem, but in a different framework, the framework of psychoanalysis, right? If all we want is pleasure and happiness, then why are we so destructive and violent? And so to explain that, he essentially posits a devil kind of figure, this death drive, and says, well, our aggressiveness is a basic function of our psyche. And we can no more get rid of our desire for destruction than we can get rid of evil, or we can get rid of unhappiness or violence in the world. And these are ineluctable parts of being human. Now, aggression, Freud says, is not necessarily against civilization. Especially in its early stages, civilization has a lot of use for aggression. Aggression can be channeled by civilization through society to benefit society. So we can think of this as, the value of war, conquest in early civilizations. But Freud is thinking more about the kind of domination of one's environment that is essentially a destructive urge, right? So he writes on page 110, the instinct of destruction, moderated and tamed, and, as it were, inhibited in its aim, must, when it is directed toward objects, provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and with control over nature. And so this aggression gives us control over nature. It allows us to be dominant. And remember, right, the first obstacle to humanity, civilization, is nature. So by driving us to have control over nature, aggressiveness helps us overcome that first obstacle. Right? So, to go and kill the lion that is hunting your community, right? Rather than run away. To go to war with the neighboring community that is raiding your camp and stealing from you, right? All of these things would be useful to society. But again, right, that destructive urge has to be moderated and tamed and inhibited in order for it to be useful. So when aggression is turned against society, civilization, it's because it's not being moderated and tamed and inhibited in the right way. Right? That aggression, just as that sexual energy needs to be channeled and tamed and inhibited, directed, so does the aggressive urge, the death drive. Right? So on 111, Freud concludes this, right? And now I think the meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must present the struggle between eros and death. Eros, right? Erotic urge, the god Eros from Greek mythology. It must present the struggle between eros and death, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore be simply described as the struggle for life of the human species. Right, so civilization, all life, is again this dynamic between two instincts, one to pleasure, one to destruction. And civilization, the history of civilization, is the history of these two instincts fighting with each other. And so civilization sort of facilitating our pursuit of pleasure, facilitating our desire for destruction, and then our pursuit of pleasure and our desire for destruction being turned against civilization and doing damage to civilization. And so there's a back and forth between these two things. All right. Now, Chapter 7 is interesting. Chapter 7 sort of gives us this story of civilizational development. And looking for this. So how does civilization develop through history? And what are the ways that this aggression is at some points tamed and at other points not? He says, well, let's begin at the beginning. Sorry. The story that he's telling in chapter 7 essentially does this. It says there is an analogy between an individual and civilization itself. That an individual goes through this process of learning to channel its instincts, right? And if we can remember from the first video, this is a process of internalizing and externalizing, of confronting external obstacles to our desire and confronting internal obstacles to our desires. So the first obstacle that the individual confronts is the father. Right? The father is to blame for us as children not getting what we want, namely our mothers. And the father then comes to represent discipline. We then internalize the father. We erect kind of image of the father within our own psyche. And this is our superego, or our conscience. But then, right, we externalize that conscience again. And in religion, that externalization is God. Right? But that it can be externalized in other ways also. And so Freud thinks civilization goes through a similar kind of process. And just as an individual develops a conscience, so a civilization develops a kind of set of ideals and values. And Freud thinks civilization then is also one of the main forces that makes an individual have conscience. That the superego is a product not just of the father and the relationship between father and child, but also of the development of civilization itself. So in another book, I believe it's called The Ego and the Id. I think that's just, the title is just The Ego and the Id. Freud talks about the way that instincts can kind of be developed through the progression of civilization. That we slowly internalize the values of our society. And that these sort of cultural ideals get turned into instincts slowly. And so Freud thinks that within the superego, there's not just our father, but also, through our father and through our life in society, there is the trace of these sort of developed, sort of refined values that have been passed down from generation to generation, to the point that they become kind of second nature. I was just thinking about this. You know, I was thinking how it's funny that in quarantine there are all these things that we still do even though we don't have to, right? We put on clothes. Why? We're not leaving the house, right? We don't have to present ourselves. I mean, except for when we have a Zoom class or whatever. Putting on clothes is almost instinctual, right? But what a strange instinct! Right? We just do it. It's almost beyond habit, right? It's something that that feels like an urge. It feels almost like an instinct. And so, I think that's maybe an interesting example of something that is certainly a product of civilization, but which is so internalized and so sort of assumed. We don't even think of that as being, certainly not part of the superego. It's just a baseline, right? It is assumed. So maybe, dressing would be an example of something that is, this kind of cultural relic. It doesn't have the possibility of oppressing us really. It doesn't even feel like an ideal. It is just a kind of civilizational baseline. But all that to say that civilization is another force that gives us a conscience. So let's read 114 here. What means does civilization employ in order to inhibit the aggressiveness which opposes it? We have already become acquainted with a few of these methods, but not yet with the one that appears to be the most important. This we can study in the history of the development of the individual. What happens in him to render his desire for aggression innocuous? Something very remarkable, which we should never have guessed, which is nevertheless quite obvious. Right? So what is it that makes this aggressiveness innocuous? His aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. It is, in point of fact, sent back to where it came from. That is, it is directed toward his own ego. There it is taken over by a portion of the ego, which sets itself over against the rest of the ego as superego, and which now, in the form of conscience, is ready to put into action against the ego, and the same harsh aggressiveness that the ego would have liked to satisfy upon other extraneous individuals. So what Freud is saying here is that the conscience is not actually a force that inhibits our aggressiveness, that the superego, that the conscience is itself an outlet for aggressiveness. And this, if you're interested, is pulled straight from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. That one of the ways civilization inhibits or manages our aggressiveness is to convince us to turn that aggressiveness against ourselves. That the conscience is a form of aggressiveness against ourselves, and that in admonishing ourselves, in lashing out at ourselves, right? You're bad. You didn't do that right. Why are you so XYZ? Why are you so lazy? Why are you so stupid, whatever, right? When we sort of punish ourselves because of our conscience, when our conscience punishes us, that Freud thinks is the primary way that we release our aggression. Our aggression is released onto ourselves. So it's a kind of brilliant strategy of civilization, Freud thinks, right? Because it does two things. First, it controls the aggressiveness of individuals. But then second, it uses that aggressiveness to control individuals in a way that will be beneficial to society itself. So how does this happen? Right? It happens through the superego. It happens sort of in tandem with the development of an individual superego. The superego becomes a tool of civilization and the development of civilization. So civilization is kind of exploiting this natural psychological tendency that we have toward aggression and toward then also, more importantly, the development of the superego. So on page 120, we get the kind of development of this. The way that society, civilization, convinces us, as Freud puts it, to renounce instinct. Because this is ultimately what civilization is about, right? Renouncing instinct. The instinct to aggression, but also the instinct to recklessly pursue sexual satisfaction. He says, originally, this is on 120, originally, renunciation of instinct was the result of fear of an external authority. One renounced one's satisfaction in order not to lose its love. And so an external authority means, right, I give up, I renounce my instinct because something outside of myself is preventing me from achieving it. Right? I'm afraid of something outside of myself, whether that is my father who's going to punish me, or whether or not that is the object of my desire itself, which I fear will rebuff me, right, or reject me. So I'm afraid of something external, and therefore I renounce my instinct. I give up on what I really want. I learn to channel my energy into something else. But with fear of the superego, the case is different, he goes on. And so originally, before the development of the superego, something external forces me to renounce my instinct. But with fear of the superego, the case is different. Here, instinctual renunciation is not enough, for the wish persists and cannot be concealed from the superego. Right? So what really changes with the development of the superego is the fact that not only must we renounce pursuing that instinct, but now we want to get rid of the instinct itself. That there's a fundamental shift with the development of the superego. Superego in both an individual and as a product of civilizational development. With the superego, we are more oppressed than when we fear something external. Because we'll only be punished by something external if we actually act on an instinct. However, when the superego is what is controlling us, then we punish ourselves not for acting on instinct, but for simply having the instinct, right? This is this discussion of, so he says on 121, right? Bad intentions are equated with bad actions. So now, with the development of the superego, what we desire is to be rid of bad instincts entirely, right? Not only to not act on them, but to not even have them, right? It's no longer enough that I don't, act on my perverse sexual desires, but the very fact that I entertain those desires or I have those urges means that I am guilty, right? Now, nothing external can know that I'm having those urges, that I'm having those desires. No one knows that I want to, kill my brother, right? Only I know that. So when the superego comes to power, when it's the superego that we're afraid of, our conscience that we're afraid of, the situation is much more dire for us, because what we ultimately desire is to be rid of, right, to not feel guilty. We have to not have these instincts, not have these urges. So Freud says, a threatened external unhappiness, loss of love and punishment on the part of the external authority, has been exchanged for a permanent internal unhappiness, for the tension of the sense of guilt. And so our superegos make us permanently unhappy because we feel guilty for having these instincts, aggressive or sexual instincts. And even if we don't act on them, even if we listen to our superego, we still feel guilty. We feel in bad conscience because they exist. But here's the thing, right? We don't have control over those instincts. We can't help having those instincts. And so this superego becomes this kind of a panopticon, right? An all-seeing punisher, one that will punish us just for having thoughts. So now, then, with this superego, we find ourselves afraid of an internal punishment, right? An internal authority. And he says, so we move from fear of something external to fear of something internal. And all this makes us miserable, right? But we can see, how I think Freud is saying that civilization is partly to blame for the development of the superego to begin with, and certainly for the particularities of the superego, and that our feeling oppressed by the superego, fearing this internal authority, makes us, perhaps rightly and perhaps wrongly, depending on the context, resent again civilization, right? That we then externalize civilization, or rather externalize this oppression that we feel, and to some extent rightly blame that on civilization. All right, so I'll stop there and we'll pick it up again in a minute.